Hello and welcome, Hare Krishna. We're back at the Atma Paradigm, and this is session 10 and the final one on our section for life. But we're continuing with part 2 of the subject we started last week, which was the tree of many fruits, which is the Atma Paradigm version of On the Origin of Species. Excuse me. Last week I suggested that you contemplate this tree of many fruits. And this is a real tree which produces 40 different types of stone fruit, all from this one tree. And I suggested that the tree offers a useful analogy for the Atma Paradigm proposition regarding the appearance of new species types. Because on this one tree of life, many different fruits, from peaches to cherries to almonds to kumquats, appear fully equipped to develop into whole fruits. None of them have evolved from other fruits on the tree. Each is an independent production. Nor do any of these fruits exist within the trunk, the branches, or the twigs of the tree in a visible form. They appear suddenly, as if out of nowhere, at the ends of the branches. But it's not out of nowhere, because the ingredients and the information for these fruits are fed to them by the energy and know-how of the tree. In a similar way, the Atma Paradigm proposes that behind the obvious manifestation of all species, animals, birds, fish, and so on, there is an invisible tree of life, a branching network of subtle energy and information. And this energy and information pops into physical existence as the many fruits of biological species. In this way, each new species type, or what we termed a jiva jati, appears fully manifest with all its features and with all its internal biological machinery fully operational. Now, the invisible energy of the tree passing from its roots through the trunk and branches and so on represents, in our analogy, the flow of formative information, and that we have called GUNA-DATA. And that GUNA-DATA information flows into the different branches of this special tree. And as it does, the information becomes specialized depending on which branch of what type of fruit is intended to be produced. So the information then specifies that particular fruit to appear at the end of that branch, a fruit distinct from the fruits on other branches of this tree. Now, last week we offered evidence from one set of experiments carried out at Princeton University that showed how group intention, in the form of particularly in excitement or emotions or focused creativity, could be harnessed to directly impact a physical device like a quantum-based random event generator. And we suggested that the principle of group intention, taking a specific information form, may be more prevalent in nature. We already understand how the intention of one individual conscious being generates information and agency, as that information acts on our own physical and biological systems. But the pair experiment, the Princeton experiments, indicate that such an effect can be scaled up when intent is aggregated, when it is added together or is cumulative or more subjectively important. It's therefore reasonable to suppose that the accumulated objectives of a group of conscious entities, the Atmas, and I'm talking about an inconceivable number of Atmas, all with the common desire for specific types of experience and expression of will, that aggregation could result in an information form. Now, these objectives would include the generalized aspirations for enjoyment of a particular type of organism, for a certain ability to eat certain things or to eat all things, to gather or to hunt food, to attack and to defend, to relax, to nest, to sleep, and to form family, social connections, maybe in herds or flocks, or to be a loner, an independent and solitary creature. Now, all of these aspirations are in pursuit of the two primary objectives of consciousness: the enjoyment and experience in all sorts of new and wonderful ways. Now, different aspirations would need to be facilitated by different sets of bodily faculties. So a particular set of aspirations would be accommodated by a particular set of perception senses and action organs. along with the cognitive facilities or faculties to match those aspirations and the functioning of those particular senses and organs. So we would have a total package of faculties for a type of species. And this is our definition of a guna species type as we gave it last week, which was a grouping of organisms with a common particularized set of perception senses and action organs, providing similar psychophysical agency and experience. So species are essentially psychological groupings, and their bodies and minds facilitate that psychological interest, with a set of senses by which they perceive the features of the world, by hearing, touching, tasting, seeing and smelling, plus specialized versions of those type of senses, maybe for energetic field perception like sensing electricity or magnetism, and a set of limbs and external organs that determine the physical attributes for motion, handling, communication, reproduction, and evacuation. So each these present together, this package produces the information form that is the template for this particular species type. And the species template is defined in terms of its specific set of GUNA-DATA, i.e. a specific permutation of the three powers or the three modes or forces at work in nature: formation, entropy and stasis, or as we kind of gave them, rajas, tamas and sattva. And when the GUNA-DATA of these three powers inhere into the fields of physical matter, they manifest physical properties in terms of the forms, the features and the qualities of a population of a whole new species. And as we explained, this isn't getting something for nothing. Why? Because the species, here's our species type template described in terms of our guna triangle. The species template is a subtle blueprint which permanently exists within nature. The gunas have that kind of data file permanently stored. And the collection of a combination of the gunas within the triangle, such as our little small purple or dark triangle that you see pointed out there, is a particular packet of species type GUNA-DATA. And this data represents the collective aspirations of those innumerable Atmas for a very specific type of enjoyment and activity, which will be facilitated by the particular set of sensory faculties. But only at certain times is it activated to manifest physically. And when it is activated, then the process that we outlined last week kicks in. And this goes like this. It's based on the metaphysical system described in the Yoga Sutras. And I would refer you to our last talk for more details on that. I will just give a summary today. The objectives of group intention are encoded in the GUNA-DATA, which produces the form of a subtle body. And this acts as the morphological template for a physical body. That same packet of GUNA-DATA defines the qualities of proto-physical reality, which then manifest as the actual physicality of the biological body for this new species. Now, another way to visualize this process is the idea we gave of how fields are regarded within physics. And we can think of this species information as a packet like a seed which will be planted onto our field grid. And here we see the GUNA-DATA described in numerical quantities along the bottom of the slide. So that information, a certain amount of data on sattva, rajas and tamas, represents the species type template. Both the template form and the field data are the same, but they're in different states and format. And like our analogy of the seeds, each of these data points of the template are planted, and so that the data point is planted in each point of the field grid. And as the field as a whole begins to manifest then as physical properties. So this inevitably starts to produce an overall emerging physicality, revealing the form, the features, the attributes, the faculties, the organs and the limbs of a brand new species. In this case, it's our wolf. Now I'm going to develop this idea a bit further and show some further justification for this and also some application of this particular model. For instance, different sections of our GUNA-DATA triangle represent the GUNA-DATA for different species. That's fair enough. So here we have two species types represented by their respective GUNA-DATA. We've got our wolf in the dark triangle, and we also have a giraffe represented by the little blue triangle. Now, each of these triangles is a unique combination, or it's its own combination of stasis, formation, and entropy. Now, they generate the species template for each of them. These, as I've said, these templates exist permanently as information forms within the cognitive elements. The cognitive elements are permanent elements of nature in the same way as the chemical elements are permanently there. We use some of them for our body, similarly use some of the cognitive elements for our mind and our own mental kind of faculties. And these templates are available to be manifest as needed and whenever required. And I think the best way to conceive of that is the kind of print-on-demand system that now exists within publishing. So you can think of the bodies of, or the type of species, are like a specific book title. But instead of a traditional publishing kind of method, which just publishes a load of books, hoping that everyone's going to come and buy them, nature applies print-on-demand. So the templates are like ready to go. They're fully complete. You know, they're like the books. They've been written. They've been edited. They're all formatted, just ready to go. But only when there is a demand do they get printed. Similarly, when there's a certain demand or requirement for a batch of a particular species, nature gets into action. And that's when she produces the species as required or demanded by the clients. And you could say the clients are like the group of Atmas who want to use it. For instance, the Atmas who need a wolf body. Bang. And nature prints at the times that are needed, depending on who asks for it, and other times another species might be needed. Here we have our giraffe manifested. Now, this system of print on demand doesn't just produce books these days, but actually thanks to 3D printing and digital knitting systems and things, you've kind of got a huge range of things you can order and buy in this way. Personalized clothes, for instance. Now, the manufacturing system or equipment is the same for each of these. The materials are common, but different garments can be produced just by changing that one thing we keep talking about, the data. Change the data, you change the product. That's nature's system. It can produce a huge range of species, personalized for a group of Atmas to enjoy and experience life in. Nature does not need to change one type into another. It has its system. Activate different GUNA-DATA and you produce a different species. Change the data, change the species. Now we'll talk more about individual personalization a bit later. For now, we're just getting ourselves kind of more familiar with the system that prints, or rather manifests, each species type independently. Excuse me. And this process is exactly what we see in the physical evidence about species. For instance, in our talk 3.4, we presented the analysis that was carried out by many paleontologists, but most significantly this gentleman here, Stephen Jay Gould. He and others questioned the assumptions of 19th and early 20th century kind of about evolution and about how species came to be. Specifically, they were challenging the idea of gradual appearance or gradual transition of one species into another, both for new groups and for new species. And here's a few examples of the sort of stuff that they were looking at and why they came to their conclusion. The first point is that the fossil record itself shows sudden appearance, not gradual not gradual transition, we should say, from something previously existing. Start with a big picture of life forms. So this chart includes all the main classes of vertebrates. i.e. creatures with a backbone. And it's got from the sharks on one side, the bony fish, the amphibians, reptiles, birds, and the mammals. Some of them, like the sharks, go all the way back to the Ordovician period, which is 450 million years or so. The solid black areas represent the actual fossil finds. But the dotted lines are assumptions. They're the assumptions of how these groups might be connected by descent to other pre-existing groups. But as we pointed out previously, since the chart is supposed to represent actual fossil finds, things that we know exist, fossils of species we found, it really should be presented as it is, more like this. And if we look at the chart without the assumed links between classes, the evidence suggests the punctuated appearance, the sudden appearance of major classes with the features of that class that characterize them are fully formed and distinct from the features of any of the other groups. Now, someone might say, well, the fossil record is not complete. It is true. There's much more I'm sure we can find. But so far, this is the story that it tells. So we shouldn't be generating another interpretation of the evidence at this point. If you get other evidence that shows something, a different story, we'll look at that. But at the moment, this is the evidence. And theory should follow the evidence. So the same point that we're making here for classes of that type of grouping is there in all the other classification of animals, orders, families, genera, and of course individual species. For instance, let's focus on one of the classes, the mammals. So I've that's the grouping over there. And we'll look at the fossil record for all the different orders within this particular class. Here they are. And you can show them along the top. Instead of trying to read all the individual names, you've kind of got everything from the marsupials on one side, and you've got rabbits and rodents and primates and insect eaters. You've got the carnivores, the cloven-hoofed animals, the cows, pigs, sheep, deers, and so on. You've got whales and dolphins, rhinos, elephants, and others. But really, in order to look at this picture objectively, we've got to ignore all those dotted lines because they're confusing the thing. They have no bearing on the reality of what the fossil record is. So let's remove them. Again, we see that each order appears in the fossil record suddenly. It cannot be linked to other predecessors, and no one has seen a way to link up even these different orders. They do seem to be individual types of critters, and that they have distinct features which do not kind of match up with others. And once that order of mammal has appeared, so we can kind of show their beginning point, and I've only circled the ones that have little pictures at the top. That group, that order of mammals starts to proliferate and either continues to the present day, or some of them, as you see here, have disappeared from the record, they've gone extinct. Now, each order has its own features. It's got its particular set of perception senses and action organs that make it distinct from the other orders. And any effort to link the orders has been speculative. And it depends on what criteria you want to apply. And I'll explain a bit more about that later on. But continuing down the taxonomic rankings, we're going to look at the next kind of level down. Actually, we're going to go down to genera. But just a word of warning, if you start to research this yourself, make sure that the charts that you're looking at are actual fossil records, i.e. they're showing fossil finds. Because most charts that you'll see in the textbook or you'll find online or in papers tend to be cladograms, designed to try to link up the species using physical features or genes and try and show where they've come from. Now, cladograms depend on what type of system is used, whether it's based on physical features as an example, or maybe on DNA and linking up genes. But either way, cladograms are trying to show the linkages. So they don't always show the exact kind of fossil finds. So here we are now with one of the genera, which is the genus, all the different groups for horse-like things. So the red vertical lines are the actual fossil finds for them. Now this, we know the horse is a very oft cited example of macroevolution in the textbooks. But when you see the actual fossil record, there is no indication of gradual change of one into the others. Each of these kind of critters, and I call them that generally, appears suddenly in their specific form within the record in different parts of the world. They exist pretty well unchanged for some time, and then all have gone extinct, except the only continuous line is actually the one genus of Equus, which is the modern horse, which is present with us today in various kind of variant forms. Now, Stephen Jay Gould and others noted that when they looked at the fossils, in every case of what a fossil could tell us, it told us that these ancient species appear in the fossil record fully formed. Now, not every fossil is complete, but whatever you can see within that fossil looks like an organ that is fully formed and fully operational. They may have different forms and may look different from creatures today, or they may seem to have some features that look like a variation of what belongs to another creature. But each creature is its own functioning organism. We don't find partly formed limbs or organs in transition. And because each creature is a holistic organism, as we've talked about in previous times, it has exactly what it needs in terms of all its senses and organs to fulfill the objectives of its species type. And it is evident that the specialized faculties of a species type are interdependent. Often one feature cannot function properly without other features or organs that are the way they are in order to support that particular feature. So once a species appears, it tends to persist in its form and features. And many species, like the dragonflies, just don't seem to have changed. Here the modern dragonfly is hardly distinguishable from its fossilized ancestor or the fossilized version even after 350 million years. On the coelacanth, we gave this example. Recently, they've been pulled out of the Indian Ocean, unchanged from its ancestor after 400 million years. The conclusions we can then draw from all of this evidence is that major groupings like classes, orders, and families appear suddenly with specific and unique features that make them distinct from other classes, and that these groupings and individual species also appear suddenly, fully formed with their own special set of perception, senses, and action organs. So from a small initial population, they proliferate. And although there is room for some variation of the species, essentially the species retains the same core senses and organs that made it distinct from other species. And a species seems to be able to retain these core features barely altered for hundreds of millions of years. So the issue here is that evolutionary theory doesn't have a mechanism that can account for these facts. Stephen Jay Gould's own theory, called punctuated equilibrium, recognized the problem, but he wasn't able to identify any biological process that could link the fact of species appearing suddenly with the principle of evolutionary modification by descent. So despite his efforts to update biology and paleontology, I think both continue to offer what are essentially outdated and unsubstantiated theories, whereas what we are proposing as part of the Atma Paradigm proposition matches the evidence much more comfortably. Now, although evolutionary theory has no direct evidence of fossil evidence of gradual development through the fossils, nor does it have any, and I will say, coherent or testable mechanism for macroevolution, it does offer some inferred evidence to justify its idea. And these fall into a few groups. First, we have homology, which is the study of similar features. And these come in, and there's three aspects of this. Three aspects of kind of commonality among species. We have common structures and organs, i.e. the physical features. We have the common use of DNA, and we have a common kind of ontogeny, i.e. what the development of the embryo. It follows in different species. The embryo seems to follow a roughly the same sort of procedure. So these three important aspects of homology. And then the next group of inferred evidence is vestiges. These are said to be remnants or imprints of ancestors left within our bodies. They might be, and they're in two forms. They might be structures and organs that maybe had a different use for our ancestors, or they could be leftover genes in our DNA, something that we're not using. However, we pointed out that saying that my body has a feature that looks like something another species has, but which that species uses differently, is really not saying anything at all. At best, it's pointing out that there may be some commonality of organs, i.e. this is an homology point. And the idea of common use of DNA tells us only that there is a common information system at work. But thanks to the Evo-Devo analysis that we talked about, we now know that there is a DNA toolkit used by a wide range of species. So no surprise that we hold certain genes that other creatures use in the production of the forms and features that they might use for forms and features we don't have. So the evidence of a wider toolkit puts the modern synthesis into doubt. Why would and how would DNA develop and hold on to genes that aren't going to be used? How would it be able to have genes that aren't going to be used for generations to come? You know, generations of descendant lines of species yet to appear. Plus, there's the issue that we seem to have got many of our shared common genes from viruses, and also from another phenomenon which complicates any idea of gradual descent, and that is horizontal gene transfer, i.e. somehow or other passed horizontally between different species. And no one's really got a good answer for how that seems to happen, i.e. much of our genome does not seem to come from our ancestors. So the common use of DNA at best is another homology category. Similarly, the last point of inferred justification, which is transitional features. As we've explained, all creatures alive now and within the fossil record, i.e. every creature we know anything about, appears with all its features fully formed. So transitional features are an estimate of what one might suggest lies between the existing usable feature of one creature and a similar usable feature in another. But there are no features that are not of adequate use for the creature to whom they belong. So at best, the proposition of alleged transitional forms is also a point of homology. So what all this inferred evidence for evolutionary theory boils down to is homology. The common presence of these three aspects. The similarity of structure and organs, the common use of DNA and many shared genes, and the process of embryo development. That's the evolutionary case in a nutshell. Now, there's no argument with these statements of commonality. I absolutely accept all of them. But I kind of find it incongruous that these three kind of forms of homology are used to substantiate a theory that doesn't itself contain a suitable mechanism that can account for that homology, i.e. the modern synthesis doesn't really tell us why there should be this specific development of structure in organs. It doesn't tell us because it doesn't give us where that form comes from. It doesn't tell us about the origin of DNA and how it might produce morphology. It doesn't tell us what is coordinating embryonic development. Now, it's probably clear to you already that our proposition of the GUNA triangle maybe can account for all of these issues of homology. For instance, we propose one unified process for the appearance of all groupings of all species types. So there is common use of an underlying GUNA-DATA information system that specifies the information form for the various templates of all the different species that will appear, and using the same printing system, that metaphysical process, or you could say the system that applied the kind of idea of the physics grid, planting the seeds of information manifesting physical properties. So the Atma Paradigm proposal would certainly account for all the identified cases of homologous commonality that exists even amongst highly diverse species types. But the Atma Paradigm can do better than that and can enter areas that evolutionary theory finds problematic. For instance, consider the point that the developmental evolutionists made about convergent evolution. How wings have appeared on creatures all ready to be used many times throughout totally unrelated groupings of species, from insects to fish to gliding squirrel, bats, reptiles and mammals. And also how there are so many versions of the eye, or an organ to convert light into electrical data. This has appeared many, many times according to the phylogenetic trees that the modern synthesis has drawn up. So the eye is appearing as an organ. Now, why? Well, the developmental evolutionists suggest that there is something pressing within nature to continually manifest such organs in one type of creature after another. And they say it can't be explained by descent with modification, but it fits the concept that all species are defined by a set of data offering them each of the 10 senses and action organs to varying degrees of acuity. So when we consider the triangle representing each and every species type, we'll find provision for specifying an organ to facilitate the sense of visual perception. There's always an eye or some form of some type, and where that isn't a highly efficient visual organ, there's often another unique method for visual or spatial awareness. So that is a provision that is a challenge for evolutionary theory. And for instance, wings are a specialized form of front limbs, which are there in all creatures as part of the template. And the front limbs can be specified for movement or for handling. And we discussed how there is going to be a trade-off for any creature, how they want to use these front or upper limbs. Wings are a specific trade-off. You know, you're really reducing handling for the benefit of flight, or for some birds, balance for running. So they're a particular specification found only in some creatures, but dotted throughout our triangle. So here's some red dots for for species with wings. This is simply illustrative. I've got no idea where certain species types fall within this grid, but we can assume that species types that are in neighboring triangles on the grid will be more closely related because they have similar GUNA-DATA, and therefore they will have similar psychological aspirations and disposition, and therefore similar, though not identical, physical faculties. So hence those species types near one another might relate to maybe kind of a bigger grouping, similar to what we might call a genus or a family or something. So in this case, this is just me kind of making the suggestion, the groupings of the red dots being creatures with wings might relate to, for instance, clusters with like birds and winged insects. But Besides those clusters, which we kind of immediately think of, there, creatures with wings, there's going to be outliers, you know, one-offs compared to their phylogenetic cousins. You know, we have the flying lizard at the bottom there, or the squirrel glider. But a system that can print on demand and produce the punctuated appearance of any species type independently of any others can quite easily handle these one-off specialities, which have features that are hard to trace back to ancestors. So basically the Guna triangle saying you need wings, or you need some kind of gliding thing between your limbs, no problem. We've got a set of GUNA-DATA will provide you just that, and print it off. Now, in our critique of the Atma Paradigm and evolutionary theory, we've been using terms that each have for species. I've been using the term Guna species type, or a Sanskrit word Jivajati, for the Atma Paradigm idea of what we mean as an individual species type. And I want to show you how it's difficult and how our idea of a species type is different in scope from the standard zoological or taxonomic use of the word species, because they shouldn't be mixed up. It's difficult in a comparison not to be using the two almost as if they are the same thing. But there is an overlap, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. Now, as we pointed out, identifying relationships using the concept of clades, i.e. physical and genetic features that may be shared as a group. These relationships depend on what criteria and methodology you use. So how you define something as belonging to a particular clade depends, are you using morphology or are you using genes? The problem is that specific groups of animals and species are counted differently by the different methods. So, for instance, here's a cladogram chart for the various orders within the family group of mammals. This one was produced using morphology, i.e. trying to link them up according to physical features. Those on the list that are closest to each other are supposed to be the most related. Now, here are the same orders of mammals as linked together in terms of similar genes. And I've kind of reversed this one just so that you can kind of join up the groups on either side. Now, the only ones that are in their normal place are the monotremes and the marsupials, and they're just weird, you know. They're definitely on their own at the top there. But the rest, there's difference. Rabbits are no longer next to rodents. The dolphins and whales are now in with the cloven hoofed creatures. You get the idea. That I'm not saying these tables are all wrong, just that classifying major groups isn't straightforward. And species are even harder to classify. There's huge debate over how a species itself should be defined. What counts as a member of a particular species? And there's also categories of what's called cryptic or hidden species, you know, where it really isn't clear, is it one, is it many species? That the situation, the water is very muddy. But here is the basic classification charts that it is used. It has a big category, life, and within life there are the main domains. And humans are part of the eukarya domain. We're organisms which have a nucleus wrapped up in our cells. And within the domains, we are part of the kingdom of Animalia. We are part of the animals. And within that kingdom, we belong to the phylum of Chordata, which means we've got a kind of notochord, which is the thing that develops into our spine and backbone. And within that phylum, there are various classes, such as the mammals. And within the mammal class, there are various orders, such as the carnivores. So that's now a different category from the one we're technically in. And within an order, there are families. And within the carnivora order, there are families such as Canidae, which are dog-like features in a very broad sense. And within that family, there are types of genus, like Canis, the actual dog types, dogs. And each zoological or botanical species is supposed to be a member of a genus. And in this case, Canis lupus, which is the wolf. Now, many of these groupings have subcategories. For instance, there's a subcategory, subspecies of Canis lupus, which is Canis lupus familiaris, which basically is the family dog. Now, there's two reasons for going through this classification system. One is, I just want to make it clear that don't underestimate how difficult it is to categorize the various groups and their species. It's not a fixed idea. It's constantly being renewed, changed as new techniques emerge. My second point in discussing these things is that we want to relate our own category of species type to a particular range of standard taxonomy groups, just as a kind of to show you where we kind of fit in within the overall kind of generalized classification system. So a guna species does not equate to a standard taxonomy species. In some cases, it might. In some cases, it might just be that what biologists call a species is what we would call a guna species type. But in other cases, we might not see the rationale. For instance, we think they may have been too finicky in claiming many creatures are a different species, like the Galapagos finches, where we saw that actually there is evidence, because of their changing habits and adapting to a new diet of human waste and food, that the small ground fish, finch, which is circled in blue, and the large ground finch circled in red, are starting to either revert towards one another or to converge towards one another. So in this way, we would question whether all these different types of finch are they really separate species? Or are many of them just variants of one species type? Maybe this group here. Or perhaps it could be all of them, just one jiva type. Now, I think there are also many cases in which a guna species type might extend beyond a group to a whole genus. For example, roses are one genus. And maybe all the varieties of roses that exist are just really one species type. And there may be some cases in which a guna species type encompasses something more than genus. Maybe a family in taxonomic terms. My point is that biology has trouble addressing the question of its categorization. It really is not satisfactory yet for them. And at this stage, I'm not suggesting the Atma Paradigm is ready to be definitive either. However, I do suggest that we have a methodology and a set of criteria that, with the sort of extensive study, research and analysis that has gone into taxonomy from the modern perspective, we should be able to produce a very reasonable picture of the relationships of the different GUNA-DATA species types. Now, for the moment though, I'd like you to think of Jiva Jati species type spanning a range of the standard life categories. Perhaps something along the lines as shown in the broad kind of graded band, Guna species type, and there's a kind of band with in green going across. So it may pick up some species types, some species in the classification chart might equal a species type. Sometimes a genus might be counted as a species, Guna species type, and perhaps there are a few families which might be a single Guna species type. One thing that is important to appreciate is that within an individual Guna species type, there is the potential for diversity and variation without a change of species. And here's the principle at work. We go back to our Guna triangle with its grid, and here we have one particular species type GUNA-DATA, but this time it's showing the spectrum, which basically means that each little triangle of the overall triangle also is composed of a huge range of Guna variants. And so here it is on its own. The spectrum within each of these tiny triangles represents the range of variants of that can be produced within that own species type. So here it is enlarged with a grid of dots. Each dot, and this is just figurative and illustrative, each dot is meant to represent a more detailed specification of the GUNA-DATA. You've got an overall set of GUNA-DATA for the species type, but within that there will be more detailed specifications. And those detailed specifications will of course fit within the overall parameters of the species type. So this offers Atmas a range, a variety of forms and features and activities within a single species type. Most of the variations are relatively minor. The creature always remains within the overall guna species. So variety is really limited to what will be achieved within the overall faculties of those 10 senses that define its particular guna species. And this is the principle we see in action with the fossils of creatures that remain hardly changed over millions of years. Tiny variations in different ways. Tiny radiations, and we'll explain that in a bit more. But really unchanged, because the GUNA-DATA, the guna species data, holds it within a particular set of 10 species. 10 senses rather. Now, for each of these points that represent, it represents a variant of that species type. So there is, each of those has got its own guna triangle. So within every variant, every individual Atma gets to have its own personalized physical body with its own further specification in terms of the gunas. So there's this hierarchy of forms for a species type. We can have a little look at this chart here. For each guna species, there is a permanently existing unmanifest species type template. And this template provides the wide potential to cover all possible evolved or devolved variants of this species type. So we have the next level, which is a huge range, perhaps, maybe many or maybe kind of few. Species variant templates exist within that one guna species type. These are variants that can become manifest. So each variant is a specific and specialized version of the overall potential that exists within the species type. And each variant template offers further specialization to produce the individual form of a certain type of that variant of the species. But an individual form, i.e. an individual body to be enjoyed by an individual unit of consciousness, an Atma. So this hierarchy is a descending process of potential being reduced. That potential is being reduced and collapsed by specialization. Nature provides wide potential to start with, but the actions of consciousness on that potential reduce it to the specifics that each individual conscious entity wishes to have for itself. This is the principle we discussed in relationship to information, and when we use that example of the countdown word game, where you've got the potential of a group of letters, but the potential within that group becomes specialized into specific words. And here we have the potential of the species. I'm looking at the third column. The potential of the species collapsing into a specialized variant, and the specialized variant then acting as a kind of reduced potential for individual specification. So this is the same thing in a slightly different way. Group intention, gathered from the subconscious intentions of an unfathomable huge number of Atmas, is represented in nature as a set of species guna data, and this data encoded in the species type template. Then subgroups of Atmas will contribute more detailed intention to specialize that overall species guna data, and that results in many specific versions of templates which are variants of the species type. So that that group conscious intention has the type of potential to act sub or unconsciously on matter. And we described how that is possible through those different experiments. Now, there was one interesting story that Per gave where they imprinted some chickens, newly hatched chicks, on a robot. This robot was driven by an REG, and the chicks kind of now assumed that this robot was its mother. So they had the robot in a yard outside the pen where the chickens were, and it, because of the random event generator in it, it would move randomly wherever. However, it seemed that the chicks were able to request or demand the robot to come closer to them much more often than would have been stochastically expected. So the idea that a small group, even of little chickens, has agency, through its intention. So from the species subgroup of intention, we have a variant template, and then further, the individual Atma offers intention, which takes the variant template and produces the subtle form and then the physical body that that individual will get to enjoy. Now, this topic of variance within a guna species type brings in the topic of microevolution. And I put the word microevolution in inverted commas, or quotation marks for our US listeners, because although it is undoubted that there are adaptations and variations of form and features within a species, I don't think it's appropriate to call this variation microevolution for two reasons. One is because there is a sort of assertion that minor variations are used to justify something bigger, i.e. macroevolution, the change of one species into another. That just seems inappropriate. But secondly, and more importantly, the process at work rarely has anything to do with the processes claimed to be the mechanism for the neo-Darwinian or modern synthesis version of what they call microevolution, i.e. the processes at work in these variations that we see are not being caused by the factors of mutations and natural selection. And I want to use a good example that has come up just in the last week or so. There was an announcement by researchers in Australia that humans are continuing to evolve much more quickly than we might have expected. Now, why would you think that's a surprise? Well, many biologists thought humans should not be evolving. Why? Because modern society has basically removed all the weapons and reasons that natural selection would use to eliminate the weaker elements of our species. So for most humans, it's no longer a mortal danger not to run fast, or to be strong, or even to be smart. We have ways of helping weaker, vulnerable, or afflicted members of our human family. So biologists have assumed that if natural selection is not at work, evolution should be at a standstill. And that's correct. It should be. But it's not. Why? Because it's not relying on that system. And this is the example that was given by the Australian team. And the reason for a picture of the arm is that certain features of the human body are changing, not just in our overall shape, which is certainly happening, but also in some of our internal organs. And so the example is that over the last 140 years, the percentage of humans having a third, what is called the median artery, has risen from 10% way back in the 1880s to 30% now. And the forecast is by the end of this century, most humans will have a third artery in their arms. Now, the interesting aspect is that they call this microevolution, but it's not related to Darwinian evolution. It is not a product of mutation, because the genetic capacity to produce this artery already exists within our genetic makeup. This artery appears during embryogenesis. And so it's not a new feature produced by a genetic mutation. Rather, it's an example of epigenetic manipulation by the organism turning on the switch to retain this feature. Nor has there been any action by natural selection in favoring this feature. Now, it may be useful to have this extra blood flow, but for modern humans, that in itself is not enough to confer additional survival or reproductivity benefit. You are not going to be removed from the gene pool by natural selection if you don't have this artery. So natural selection or mutations are not working here. So therefore, it's misleading to call it microevolution. There's a reason they do, of course, because many biologists don't like to talk about microevolution. They just like to talk about evolution, because they don't like, maybe people like myself, trying to distinguish what are small changes from the so-called big changes of the species. But when you talk about humans, you daren't just call that evolution, because if getting a third artery means that I'm now a different species, then there's all sorts of legal, ethical, social repercussions on that. So, but better they don't use microevolution here. So this is an example of adaptation, and that's a fair enough term. It's a sort of adaptation we've been talking about in the Atma Paradigm, and also championed by the Evo-Devo biologists, because the DNA toolkit allows for the variance of our features, but it is often the subconscious intention of the organism that determines what is wanted or needed. Now, the other example that was mentioned by this Australian team of biologists was wisdom teeth. Apparently more and more humans are being born without them. We don't need them, they're a hassle, and now we're starting to do without them. And for this, I have to declare an interest. Now, the image at the top shows a typical impacted wisdom tooth, but the image at the bottom, that was the only one I could find that was in any way resembled the X-ray of my own wisdom teeth way back in my late teenage years. And if group intention is a thing, and I believe it is, and knowing what I went through with my wisdom teeth, then activating an epigenetic switch to get rid of them, that's definitely got my vote. Now, that might seem flippant, but I think that the process within nature is not really that different. I don't think it's even that much more complex than that, you know, because we gave you the examples of the Alaskan stickleback, where separate groups developed different features to cope or take advantage of different foods, and the blue mussels of the east coast of America bolstering their shells against the attack of the invasive Asian shore crab. These are not Darwinian processes, so they're misleading to call them microevolution. Adaptation is reasonable, but I suggest we build that term using and acknowledge the causal principle that it's at work here. These are examples of co-intentional adaptation. Now, this is the possibility of groups of Atmas already embodied in a particular species, varying their own forms and features to a limited extent. And probably one of the best examples of this, of what is called kind of adaptive radiation, are the cichlid fish shown in this diagram. And I apologize, it's very small perhaps in maybe some of your screens, but the point to note is just how many different varieties of this cichlid species exist, you know, coming out, and they're all kind of radiating. And no one's really clear what the species is that they're radiating from, but they're basically all cichlids. We would say this is one species type. And this particular radiation exists within the Great Lakes of East Africa, Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, and Lake Malawi. Now, hundreds of variants of these cichlids there, and they have the uncanny ability to change their form and features depending on their environment and diet. So from a certain species type, there are an incredible number of variants, but we know that they all remain one species type because the adaptations they undergo are plastic, and that's a technical term, meaning they are potentially reversible. And the other feature of their adaptation that matches the Atma paradigm is that the variant cichlids in different lakes which are not connected to one another start to show convergent adaptation. So from different points of specialized variants, they develop further features that actually parallel the features of cichlids from other lakes. So different features have been, the same features have been developed from different starting points. This is a kind of effect of what we would say is the GUNA-DATA kind of information within a species type. So let me now tie together into these principles of the punctuated appearance of a novel species type and the later development of variants from that type. So the simple picture would be that there is a single punctuated manifestation of a new population of a particular species type somewhere on Earth at a particular time. And from that point on, there would be a radiation of variants, devolved as specialized versions from the original species type. So these devolved variants are not new species in our terms, they remain part of the same species stock. And the impetus and the mechanism for this radiation is not the blind processes claimed by modern synthesis, but the impetus is the variation of the species is arising from group intentionality. It is linked to the psychological drives of conscious entities coordinating the specialized use of their own DNA toolkit, a DNA toolkit that exists as part of the original species type. And that's a simple picture. I think it's actually a little bit more dynamic than that. I think it's more like this, that the demand and requirements for a particular species type may necessitate the species type being activated more than once, perhaps many times in different places, and because of different circumstances, and because of different time periods. And on each occasion, it may be manifest as an already partly specialized version of the actual species type template. So in effect, the first appearance of a population of the species may be as a variant version of the species, perhaps specialized for a particular climate, circumstance, or time. And we would call this type of original manifestation a crown variant, meaning it's the one from which other variants will be devolved as specialized subvariants. But it is a punctuated appearance of a crown variant rather than the whole species template. And I personally feel that since every location and situation on planet Earth has its own unique challenges and opportunities for living entities, it seems more likely that a particular specialized version of the species template will be needed. And you could even speculate that planet Earth may not be the only place in the universe that these species are wanted. So it's also possible that a new population of the original or a variant of a species type or a variant of the same species type can re-manifest if the previous population became extinct. And that might explain the missing periods of species within the fossil record, the so-called Lazarus species, i.e. the ones that went extinct but somehow rose from the dead. So I kind of favor this kind of version of the punctuated manifestation, i.e. of crown variants. Now, crown variants are still produced from the same GUNA-DATA stock of the species template. So, and the variants, therefore, in our terms, would be a single species type. But from their manifestation, they may have, from the moment of their manifestation, they may have different features within their variant template. And they may exhibit different forms, and different behavior, different personality, maybe different psychology. And each of these crown variants can then be developed in the same way we talked about earlier, that each crown variant will give rise to adaptive radiations of perhaps many devolved subvariants. And perhaps any of these subvariants can themselves become even more specialized into sub-subvariants. However, what is seen in evolutionary terms is that as a creature becomes more specialized, it seems to have then less scope for further specialization. The potential is becoming narrower and narrower and narrower with each kind of level of specialization, because the species type has to keep it within the limitations of its original manifestation, i.e. the original GUNA-DATA of that species type. That's what we observe. That's what matches our Atma Paradigm model. Now, I think what we've covered an awful lot of things today, and I just want to kind of go through a little summary. But instead of kind of summarizing all the individual points we made, I just like to kind of conclude by saying I hope we've explained some detail of the processes that we see at work within the punctuated appearance of new populations of a species type, and what happens to that species type, how it proliferates, how it produces variants, and all the different manifestations of that species type that we get to see on Earth. And not only does this help to explain and cover all the observations that are used to justify the notion of evolution, but this proposition that we've offered accommodates many of the anomalies that contradict and plague evolution as a proposition. So this whole kind of presentation of what happens in life really stems from our earliest analysis, that consciousness is an irreducible feature of reality. And from that axiom, from that discovery, comes the opportunity that we had to look afresh at our assumptions within biology and physics. It has given us the chance to see a whole new set of principles acting in nature based on the ability of consciousness to manipulate the information content of physical things. Now, there are still many questions to be answered. And although we've offered some light on the how things happen question, we haven't touched the why. Now, modern science prefers to ignore the why on the basis that there's no causal principle or purpose at work, so why is irrelevant. But when consciousness is at the heart of your paradigm, it's appropriate to want to explore the big questions. So sort of things like, why do certain Atmas get to experience certain species bodies? Where has this system within nature come from? And if consciousness is an aspect of reality outside of time, what happens to it either before or after its period in a particular body? Now, we've got lots and lots still to talk about life, but to do that justice, we're now going to draw back in the Atma Paradigm and look at the bigger picture. So from now, we're moving into part 4 of this series, the universe and beyond. And I hope that you're going to continue with me as we start our exploration of the universe and understand even more about the nature of our own existence within it in terms of life and the nature of our own consciousness. So stick with us. We've got 8 talks on part 4 starting next week, Thursday the 29th of October, same time in the UK, 6 o'clock. And yes, please, we welcome comments and ideas and questions to info@s-pi.org. And I thank you very much for staying with me this evening. Hare Krishna.